detective paused the video and looked across the table. What we just watched is a 9-year-old begging for mercy. Across the room, the woman barely reacted. Hours earlier, that same child had been found motionless inside her own home. But by the time investigators opened the security system, they realized something chilling. This wasn't an accident. Someone inside that house had been hurting her for a long time, and the cameras had been watching the entire time.
We think that there's more people involved in this that should be sitting in the chair you're sitting with too. So, I want to hear from you. What happened?
Honestly, I can't say how she passed away. When I found her, she was sleeping. All I can say is, she did receive whoopings. The girls told me that she fell that day when I was asleep. When I was sleeping, I did not witness that fall. I don't know how she passed. I don't know how she passed away, honestly.
Before we continue, we want to give a brief warning. The case you're about to hear involves the death of a young child and contains themes that some viewers may find upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. If you're new to Dark Minds, welcome. This channel is dedicated to carefully documenting real criminal cases and bringing attention to victims whose stories deserve to be remembered. If you believe in the importance of raising awareness through responsible true crime storytelling, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see viewers joining us from different parts of the world. Now, with that said, we need to go back to the beginning of what happened. June 17, 2024 began as an ordinary morning in the quiet town of Montverde, Florida. The residential neighborhood was calm, with most homes still settling into the routine of a new day. But shortly after sunrise, emergency dispatchers received a call from inside one of those homes. The caller reported that a child inside the house was not responding. Paramedics and deputies from the Lake County Sheriff's Office were immediately dispatched to the address. Within minutes, emergency vehicles arrived outside the residence. What began as a routine emergency response quickly shifted into something far more serious. Inside the home, first responders located 9-year-old Jamaria Sessions. The child was unresponsive. Paramedics attempted to assess her condition while deputies began securing the scene. Despite efforts from emergency personnel, it became clear that Jamaria had already passed away. The death of a child is always treated with urgency and caution by investigators. Even in situations that appear to involve natural causes, law enforcement follows strict procedures to ensure that every possibility is considered. Deputies began documenting the home immediately. They took photographs, recorded observations, and noted the positions of rooms and furniture inside the house. At the same time, they began speaking with the adults and children who were present in the home. One of the first people deputies spoke with was Tyshael Martin. Martin lived in the house and had been responsible for supervising several children inside the residence. When deputies asked her what had happened that morning, she explained that she had discovered Jamaria earlier and realized something was wrong. According to Martin, Jamaria had not been feeling well recently. She suggested that the child may have been dealing with an illness and that the situation might have developed overnight. Martin told deputies she had gone to check on Jamaria and found that she was not responding. Deputies listened carefully while documenting her explanation. At this stage of an investigation, officers avoid making assumptions. Instead, they focus on gathering information, preserving evidence, and establishing a timeline of events. While deputies continued to speak with Martin, other officers began identifying the people who lived inside the house. Several children were present. Among them were Martin's daughters, including Nia, Dia, and Desera. Each child remained inside the home while investigators worked to understand what had happened. Detectives also confirmed that Jamaria's father, Lowan Sessions, was connected to the household, though he was not present at the residence when deputies arrived that morning. As deputies moved through the house, they began documenting each room. They examined common areas, bedrooms, and hallways, carefully noting anything that might help reconstruct the events leading up to the emergency call. Every detail mattered at this stage. Investigators also began establishing a timeline. They asked Martin about the previous evening. When had Jamaria last been seen awake? Who had spoken with her? What activities had taken place inside the house the night before? Martin responded to these questions calmly. She explained that the household had followed a normal routine and that nothing unusual had occurred during the night. According to her account, Jamaria had been resting and there had been no immediate signs of a serious problem. Deputies recorded every statement. Meanwhile, paramedics had already confirmed that Jamaria was deceased. That determination changed the nature of the response immediately. What had initially been treated as a medical emergency was now being handled as a potential death investigation. Detectives from the Lake County Sheriff's Office were notified and began heading to the scene. When experienced investigators arrive at cases involving unexpected deaths, they begin by reviewing the information already collected by patrol deputies. They also examine the physical environment where the incident occurred. Shortly after detectives arrived, they began speaking with Martin again. This time the questions became more specific. Detectives asked about Jamaria's health, recent activities, and any possible incidents that might explain what had happened. They also asked about who had been present inside the home during the night and early morning hours. As Martin continued explaining the situation, detectives took careful note of the timeline she described. At first, the explanation appeared straightforward. But as investigators compared details from the scene with the statements they were hearing, small inconsistencies began to surface. Some of the details did not fully align. Detectives did not confront anyone immediately. Instead, they continued documenting the scene and gathering information from everyone involved. And on the morning of June 17th, inside that home in Montverde, detectives were beginning to realize that the circumstances surrounding Jamaria Sessions' death required a much closer look. Jamaria Sessions was 9 years old at the time of her death. Those who knew her described a child who was still adjusting to a series of changes that had reshaped her family life in a short period of time. 2 years earlier, in 2022, Jamaria's world shifted dramatically. Her mother, Tadina Dort, passed away after battling serious health issues. Tadina had been a central figure in the lives of her daughters, and her death left a gap that extended far beyond the immediate loss. Family members say Tadina had worked hard to provide stability for her children, and her passing forced a difficult transition. After Tadina's death, Jamaria and her younger sister Jamaria Sessions entered a new chapter. Custody of the girls was assumed by their father, Lowan Sessions. In legal terms, this placed responsibility for the children's care directly with him. But Lowan was not living alone. He was in a relationship with Tyshael Elise Martin, a woman who had several children of her own. Over time, the household became a blended family environment where multiple children were living under the same roof. For Jamaria, this meant adjusting not only to the loss of her mother, but also to a completely different living situation. Relatives on Tadina's side of the family watched these changes closely. Among them was Jamaria's aunt, Skyla, who remained in regular contact with other family members about the children's well-being. Jamaria's grandmother was also involved and continued to monitor how the girls were adapting to life after Tadina's death. According to relatives, the transition raised concerns early on. Family members had hoped to maintain a close role in the girls' lives following Tadina's passing. They wanted to ensure that Jamaria and Jaliyah had consistent support during a difficult time. But with custody now under Lowan Sessions, the decisions about the children's daily lives rested primarily within his household. That household included Tyshael Martin, who had become a central authority figure in the home. Over time, relatives began expressing unease about the arrangement. Conversations within the family focused on whether the environment Jamaria was living in was the right one for her. These concerns were discussed privately among relatives, including Jamaria's aunt Skyla and her grandmother. They questioned whether the adjustment had been too sudden and whether the children were receiving the stability they needed. Despite those concerns, the living arrangement remained unchanged. Jamaria continued living with her father and with Tyshael Martin in the Montverde home. Her younger sister Jaliyah remained part of the family as well, though the two girls would experience different paths within the household over time. By the summer of 2024, Jamaria had been living under that arrangement for nearly 2 years. To investigators reviewing the case later, understanding this family structure became an important part of the broader picture. It revealed how a young girl who had already experienced significant loss found herself navigating a new environment, new authority figures, and a household dynamic that extended far beyond her immediate family. The home in Montverde where Jamaria Sessions lived was shared by several children and 2 primary adults responsible for the household structure. Investigators later focused on understanding how daily life inside that home operated, who controlled it, and how decisions about the children were made. At the center of that household was Tyshael Elise Martin. She lived in the home with her own children and had become the primary adult supervising many of the daily routines inside the house. Those routines involved multiple children living under the same roof. Among the children living there were Nia, Dia, and Desera. Each of them had their own schedules, responsibilities, and interactions within the household. Investigators later spoke with individuals connected to the home in order to understand how those children were managed and what rules were expected of them. What began to emerge during the investigation was a household environment that operated under an unusually strict structure. According to messages later reviewed by investigators, discipline inside the home followed a very specific system. The adults described this structure using a phrase that appeared repeatedly in their communications. They referred to it as boot camp. The term appeared in text exchanges between Tyshael Martin and Jamaria Sessions. Those conversations were later recovered from mobile devices and became part of the evidence investigators reviewed while reconstructing life inside the home. In those messages, the phrase did not appear as a casual description. Instead, it was used to outline a disciplinary system that the adults had implemented as a way of managing behavior among the children in the house. The routines described in the messages included structured physical tasks and strict expectations about obedience. According to investigators reviewing the conversations, the adults discussed how the routines were intended to enforce discipline and correct behavior. The messages showed that both Martin and Sessions were aware of the system and discussed it openly. According to investigators reviewing the statements, these routines had been in place for some time. They were not introduced suddenly. Instead, they appeared to have developed gradually as the adults attempted to enforce a particular style of discipline within the home. As detectives continued building the timeline, they turned their attention to another important source of information. The house was equipped with a surveillance camera system. These cameras had been installed throughout several areas of the property and had recorded activity inside the home during the days leading up to June 17. When investigators gained access to the system, they discovered that the cameras had been active during the period they were trying to reconstruct. The recordings provided detectives with a unique view into the daily environment of the household. Investigators began reviewing hours of footage, searching for moments that aligned with the timeline they were developing through phone messages and witness statements. As they analyzed the recordings, detectives noticed repeated patterns of activity that appeared to match the disciplinary routines described in the phone conversations. These moments did not appear random. Instead, they reflected the structured approach to discipline that the adults had discussed in their messages. When reconstructing events leading up to a death, detectives often look for patterns that reveal how people behaved over time. Those patterns can help determine whether actions were sudden and unexpected or part of a longer sequence of events. In the Montverde home, the emerging timeline suggested that the disciplinary system described in messages between Martin and Sessions had been actively implemented during the days before June 17. The recordings provided direct visual documentation of activity inside the home. Instead of relying solely on statements or recollections, detectives could examine actual footage captured at specific times. During the continued review of the surveillance system, investigators began examining a series of recordings that involved another element inside the home: the family dog. The Montverde residents had a large dog living on the property. As detectives worked through the extensive video archive recovered from the surveillance system, they noticed that the dog appeared in several recordings captured inside the house. At first, the animal's presence did not seem unusual. Many households with pets naturally include them in everyday routines. But as investigators reviewed more of the recordings, certain interactions involving the dog began drawing closer attention. Some of the clips showed moments where the dog was present during disciplinary situations involving Jamaria. Detectives studying the footage began carefully documenting these segments. Each clip was cataloged and time-stamped, then added to the investigative timeline alongside the other evidence that had already been collected. Investigators wanted to understand exactly what role the dog may have played during these interactions. To do this, they examined the recordings frame by frame. In several of the clips, the dog appeared in close proximity during moments when Jamaria was being disciplined inside the house. Investigators noted that the animal's behavior seemed influenced by verbal instructions given by an adult in the room. According to investigators reviewing the footage, those instructions appeared to encourage the dog's involvement in the situation. After the scene inside the Montverde home had been processed, Jamaria Sessions was transported to the medical examiner's office for a formal examination. In cases involving the death of a child, medical investigators are tasked with determining not only the cause of death, but also whether there are signs that point to a broader pattern of harm. The examination was conducted by the regional medical examiner responsible for cases in Lake County. The process began with a careful review of Jamaria's medical history, available records, and information provided by investigators who had responded to the scene. Medical examiners also reviewed photographs and documentation taken by deputies at the residence. These materials help provide context about the environment where the death occurred. During the examination, the medical examiner evaluated the child's overall condition and documented findings relevant to the investigation. Each observation was recorded in the official report, which later became a critical part of the case file. After completing the analysis, the medical examiner reached several conclusions. The findings indicated that Jamaria had experienced repeated physical harm over an extended period of time. The report described evidence consistent with ongoing mistreatment rather than a single isolated incident. For investigators, this conclusion was significant. Determining whether an injury or death results from a single event or a longer pattern of behavior often changes the direction of a criminal investigation. In this case, the medical findings suggested that the situation inside the home had developed over time. The medical examiner ultimately determined that the death was linked to complications associated with repeated physical trauma. This conclusion aligned with the patterns investigators had already begun identifying through other forms of evidence, including digital communications and surveillance recordings. The autopsy findings were then formally submitted to the Lake County Sheriff's Office and to prosecutors assigned to review the case. Those findings would later become a central component of the investigation, helping authorities understand not only how Jamaria died, but also the conditions that led up to that moment. Once investigators had assembled the evidence gathered from the residence, the digital records, and the findings from the medical examination, the case moved into the next stage of the criminal process. Detectives presented the results of their investigation to prosecutors in Lake County. Together, they reviewed the timeline that had been built through surveillance recordings, phone data, witness statements, and forensic analysis. The material outlined how the disciplinary system inside the Montverde home had operated and who had been responsible for enforcing it. After reviewing the evidence, authorities determined that criminal charges were warranted. Tyshael Elise Martin was taken into custody and formally charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and child neglect. Investigators alleged that Martin had played a direct role in carrying out the disciplinary practices inside the home that ultimately led to Jamaria's death. The charges reflected what detectives believed the evidence demonstrated, that the treatment Jamaria experienced inside the household had been deliberate and sustained over time. The investigation also focused on the role of Jamaria Sessions, Jamaria's father. Prosecutors concluded that Sessions had been aware of the disciplinary system being used in the home and had failed to intervene to protect his daughter. Based on that conclusion, he was arrested and charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child. According to investigators, the communications recovered during the digital forensic analysis showed that Sessions knew how discipline was being carried out and continued to support the approach rather than stopping it. With both suspects now in custody, the case moved from the investigative phase into the legal system, where the evidence collected by detectives would be examined in court. While the legal case moved forward, both defendants were held in custody awaiting the next stage of court proceedings. During this period, communication between them did not stop. Investigators later learned that Tyshael Elise Martin and Jamaria Sessions had begun exchanging handwritten letters while in jail. Like most detention facilities, the jail maintained procedures that allow investigators to review certain correspondence connected to active criminal cases. When authorities became aware of the letters, they requested copies through the appropriate legal channels. Those letters were eventually obtained by investigators and added to the growing case file. Detectives and prosecutors reviewed the messages carefully. Each page was examined to determine whether the correspondence contained statements that could help clarify what had taken place inside the Montverde home. According to investigators familiar with the review process, some portions of the letters appeared to reference the disciplinary system that had been implemented inside the household. In several passages, the language used by the defendants suggested an awareness of the events investigators had been examining. Prosecutors believed certain statements could be interpreted as acknowledging responsibility for decisions made within the home. For legal teams on both sides of the case, the letters quickly became significant.
You can do it on purpose, so that's not premeditated, but you have to explain it, everything, but get a good deal for a full confession or cooperation. Then from Martin, Although I don't remember doing the things I saw in that video, the video is proof that it happened. At this point, all we can do is confess to God our mistakes, vow to do better, repent, etc. Sessions is charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child. Martin is charged with first-degree murder, accused of killing Sessions' daughter, Jamaria.
Prosecutors began evaluating whether the correspondence could be introduced as evidence in court. If allowed, the letters could provide insight into how the defendants themselves described the events investigators had already reconstructed through digital records and surveillance footage. The exchange of letters also revealed that communication between the two continued even after the arrests. As the case moved toward the courtroom, investigators recognized that these written messages could become another important piece of evidence in explaining what had happened inside the Montverde residence. As news of the investigation spread, the case quickly reached beyond the quiet neighborhood where the events had taken place. Reports began circulating across Florida, and soon the story drew national attention. For Jamaria Sessions' relatives, the public attention carried a single purpose: to make sure her case would not be overlooked. Family members spoke openly about their desire for accountability. Jamaria's grandmother addressed reporters and investigators, describing the loss as something no family should ever have to experience. Her message was direct. She wanted the legal process to move forward and for the evidence gathered in the investigation to be fully examined in court. Jamaria's aunt, Skyla, also spoke about the case. She emphasized that the family intended to follow every stage of the legal proceedings. According to Skyla, their focus was on ensuring that the circumstances surrounding Jamaria's death were addressed through the justice system. As the investigation continued, community members across Florida began following the case closely. For many, Jamaria's story became a reminder of how important it is for serious allegations involving children to be investigated thoroughly and brought before a court of law. As the investigation concluded, the case moved into the courtroom. Prosecutors formally filed charges based on the evidence gathered during the months of investigative work. Both Tyshael Elise Martin and Lowan Sessions appeared in court and entered not guilty pleas. With those pleas entered, the case transitioned into the pretrial phase, where attorneys on both sides began preparing their legal arguments. During this stage, prosecutors continued reviewing the evidence collected by detectives. Much of that evidence centers on the digital material recovered during the investigation. Surveillance recordings, phone communications, and system activity logs are expected to play a central role once the case reaches trial. Legal filings also indicate that prosecutors are considering pursuing the death penalty against Martin if she is convicted. That decision reflects the seriousness with which authorities view the allegations connected to the case. For now, the legal process continues to move forward through hearings, evidence review, and preparation for trial, where the full scope of the investigation will ultimately be presented before a jury. The investigation into Jamaria Sessions' death brought together multiple forms of evidence that helped detectives understand what had been happening inside the Montverde home. Surveillance recordings captured activity inside the residence. Digital analysis revealed conversations discussing disciplinary practices. Medical findings helped investigators understand the physical conditions Jamaria had endured. Each piece of evidence contributed to a larger picture that detectives worked carefully to assemble. Cases involving children often carry profound consequences, not only for families but for entire communities. They raise difficult questions about responsibility, protection, and accountability. As this case continues through the courts, the final outcome will be determined through the legal process. If you want updates as the case develops, consider subscribing to the channel. We follow major investigations closely and provide detailed breakdowns as new information becomes available. You can also share your thoughts in the comments and join the discussion respectfully. Conversations like these help keep public attention focused on cases that deserve careful examination and justice through the legal system.